I've been skydiving twice in my life. I want to break down my experience of skydiving. I also want to break down the worthiness wound, and I want us to think about how healing happens, not only from the metaphor of skydiving, but also in how I understand the worthiness wound, so that we may learn how to take up greater space in the world. Hello, everybody. I'm Thaís Sky. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm so thrilled to have you here in my home office for a really cozy conversation about the worthiness wound. I haven't done a podcast strictly on the worthiness wound in a long time, but I do have a lot of content on my podcast about the worthiness wound. In fact, I have two series that I've done on the podcast where I break down the worthiness wound in all sorts of different ways. You can find both of those series in my show notes, so that if you want more after you hear this episode on the worthiness wound, you can get all the access to all the series on my iTunes, okay, on my podcast. But I come to you this week talking about the worthiness wound. Yes, I also want to talk about my skydiving experience and what I take from that. And I'm doing all of this because we are officially in worthiness season, which, if you're new to this part of the internet, the worthiness season is an opportunity for me to share my knowledge, my thoughts, tools, resources to guide you into your worth, all in honor of doors opening for my signature group program, Worthy Women Rise. Worthy Women Rise is a year-long container of healing and exploration geared for women who are wanting to tend to their worthiness wound, wanting to understand how to make space within themselves so that they don't collapse so quickly into feelings of inadequacy, feelings of too muchness, so they can have the life that they crave, the relationships that they crave, etc. And so worthiness season comes to us once or twice a year. This year, it's coming to us twice, which is really exciting. For those of you who have been in my sphere for a while, you know that I tend to offer a lot of free goodies during worthiness season, this season being no different. And so you can join my email list, thaissky.com/email, so that you can get in on all the goodies as I release them. One of them starts in 2 weeks, and I'm really excited to share more next week with all of you. If you're interested in learning more about Worthy Women Rise, you can go to worthywomenrise.com. You can also go to the show notes, go into the comments to get the link for the sales page that kind of breaks down how the program works, why it's a year long. And I talk a lot about how my methodology is kind of baked to support us in tending to our worthiness wound based off of over a decade of experience in understanding and doing research around the worthiness wound. Okay, so Worthy Women Rise, I'll continue to talk more about the program throughout this conversation as well, simply because it just so easily lends itself into a conversation about the program. But this episode is not just strictly about the program. I really want to give a deep dive about the worthiness wound. I want to kind of break down how we can understand the worthiness wound so that we can kind of not only understand ourselves a little bit more deeply, but know how to tend to it and know how to relate to it. So who am I? Well, have been doing this work of supporting women navigate the complexities of being human in this messy, crumbling world for over a decade as a coach and as a psychotherapist. I also write pretty extensively, and I have my podcast Reclaim, and I do my group program, as well as a depth coach mentorship. So those are kind of the big ways in which I work with people. And I started my healing journey really trying to tend to an eating disorder, but also trying to understand why it felt so unsafe to be in relationships, why it felt like I had to make a choice. Either I have relationships or I have myself, but I can't really have either or. And I really struggled with, how do I feel full and whole and worthy? And how can I bring that into the relationships that matter to me? Because what I tend to find that women do, but that certainly that I do, is that we tend to go very quickly into pleasing mode. We go into comparison mode. We go into perfectionistic mode. We go into these kind of techniques, these ways of relating that really robs us of our own wellness, that robs us of our own vitality, right? That robs us of our own mind, because we genuinely believe that in order to belong, we have to lose ourselves. And this is kind of baked into our culture. If you think about this idea of being selfless versus being selfish, right? We're kind of told that there are certain ways in which we operate in the world that are selfish. And I actually find that there are ways that we can operate in the world that is selfish, and it tends to not be how we think of selfishness. If we're really concerned about being selfishness, odds are we're probably not selfish. But to be selfless, right? That's the goal, to not have a self, to lose ourselves entirely to other people, to pleasing and making everybody happy. There's something about that that feels like it's the goal for many of us. But the problem is it doesn't often work. We can't really lose ourselves. And so we develop kind of coping strategies in order to make sense of why we're losing ourselves in relationships. And all of that kind of gets shriveled down into what I call the worthiness one. But let's back up a little bit and let's talk about my skydiving experience. So I've skydived twice now. Skydove. I've gone skydiving twice. One thing that I really appreciate about skydiving when you're on the ground and the equipment is going on you and you're getting a kind of tutorial, kind of a little video or a little explanation of what to expect. One of the things that they tell you is that when you're jumping out of the airplane, it's really important for you to keep your posture open. So they want you to completely open your chest, to open up your arms, open up your legs, and to lift your chin. Now, this can sound and is really terrifying when you're jumping out of an airplane, because the first, what is instinctual, what you want to do, right, what feels most right when you're jumping out of an airplane is to curl up, get as small as possible, right, to protect ourselves for the impending crash that we are kind of unconsciously in a nervous system anticipating, because our nervous system may not really understand or trust the parachute and how that works. What I love about that kind of understanding of skydiving, right, that we actually have to do the opposite of, is that it applies so beautifully to how we tend to relate to ourselves and relate to our own healing. When we are on the journey of wanting to repair what has been broken inside of us, what we tend to want to do is to make the world as comfortable as possible. We want, for example, if we have abandonment challenges, if we really struggle with the idea that people will leave us, we tend to imagine that healing looks like finding relationships where nobody leaves. If we can find really secure relationships where the person won't leave, then we won't ever feel abandoned. And therefore, our abandonment wound will disappear. It doesn't work that way, though, does it? Because life is unpredictable. And no matter how much we may try to control for it, people leave. They may leave willingly, right? They may leave temporarily. They may leave unwillingly. Death is a part of life. But even something like a vacation, let's say that our partner decides that they want to go on vacation with their friends. That may be in our nervous system a form of leaving. And suddenly we are right back to how it felt when our, caregiver left us at a young age. And suddenly it doesn't matter that our partner has been with us every single moment of our relationship, that they've actually never left us. The unconscious can't discern between them leaving for a vacation and them leaving forever. So all we are aware of is that there is a leaving and there may not be a return, just like there wasn't a return. And so even though all the evidence points that our partner is not going to leave us, that this vacation is temporary, we may find ourselves feeling anxious. We may find ourselves feeling really overwhelmed. We may find ourselves, doing all sorts of things, getting into a fight before they leave so that it doesn't hurt that much. We may find ourselves never getting into relationships because relationships are so scary. So there's all sorts of ways in which we protect ourselves from feelings of abandonment. And rightfully so, it really hurts. but it often doesn't lead us to healing the abandonment wound, right? To healing the wound. We're just protecting ourselves from the pain of it, whether it's trying to get ourselves into relationships that won't ever leave, or whether we never get into relationships. None of these are actually foolproof ways to never feel the pain. Because truly, at the end of the day, healing is about not ever experiencing pain, but it's actually about learning how to digest it, how to explore it, how to process it. So when it comes to abandonment, it's not about never having anybody leave us, but it's actually about being able to open up ourselves, right? To open up our bodies, if we're talking about the skydiving metaphor, and to open into the experience. But what does that look like when we're terrified? Well, that's where a container like Worthy Women Rise can really help and really fills it in, because through my support, through me being there every step of the way, I will gently guide each woman to find ways to open up to the experience and find that actually everything is quite survivable. Things that we couldn't digest and process in childhood, now we can find language to process and digest as adults. The worst things that have happened in our lives that we're terrified of happening again, those really bad things, the worst of it has already happened. It's never going to be that bad ever again. I promise you. So when we're talking about the worthiness wound, that's the point of this episode, right? We're talking about healing the worthiness wound. We tend to think that to heal the worthiness wound is to never feel inadequate again. That with certain tools or certain mantras or certain affirmations, certain, strategies, we can set up our lives so that we never feel inadequate again. And there's a huge market for this. There's a lot of people out in the world that are kind of selling this fantasy and selling this idea that if you just know what to do, you will never burn again. But I'm here to tell you that when it comes to healing something like the worthiness wound, the metaphor that is much more apt, that is much more relevant, that is much more applicable is the skydiving metaphor, where healing isn't about protecting ourselves so we never experience pain, but actually learning how to open ourselves up and experience it now in ways that we may find language for what has never been felt. That is when we feel things, particularly in relationship with another person who can hold us and can be empathic and can be kind of in the container with us, we start to metabolize what we couldn't metabolize then. That's what I offer in Worthy Women Rise. That's what the power is of actually healing the worthiness wound. It's not that you'll never feel inadequate again, but that you'll be able to learn how to hold your inadequacies when it arises, so it doesn't completely shut you down. But if I were to promise you that you would never feel unworthy again, what I'm also promising you is that you'll never really fully live again, because life and worth are intricately tied to each other. Anytime we do something new, we're going to feel the pangs of unworthiness or inadequacy or too muchness. Anytime we go for a job interview, we ask for a pay raise. Anytime we go on a date, anytime that we say to the person that we love them for the first time, all of these kind of moments in time put us directly into contact with feelings of fear, of inadequacy, of fear of getting shut down, rejected, fears that were too much for people. And yet those are the very things that make us feel most alive, right? So the worthiness work, the work of Worthy Women Rise, the work of tending to the worthiness wound is not about getting smaller, but about learning how to get bigger, how to take up more space, how to feel more full and whole within ourselves by being fearlessly, or with tons of fear, but being fierce in our capacity to look at the things that we've been too scared to look at because we never had anyone to look at it with us. There's something really amazing about doing the healing work as adults. We're asked to, in some ways, uncover things that have been very smartly put away. And that takes a tremendous amount of risk. And the cool thing about healing is that it's possible for all of us who want it. And when we do the healing work, what we're really doing is kind of becoming more of who we were born to be. There's something really, really just wonderful about it. And so when I think about the healing metaphor and I think about skydiving and I think about the worthiness wound, I really tie it together that, part of what allows us to really change things permanently in our lives instead of just putting band-aids is to really go into things with eyes wide open, to really look and open and explore. And this really does go against so much of what we want to do, which is that we want to hide and we really want to believe that there's nothing that can really support us. This is the ways in which the worthiness wound can be very, very stubborn. Because part of the worthiness wound, part of what allows it to continue to flourish in our lives, is that it's a closed loop system. It's a system that really denies new data. Because if we were to truly, truly be able to see the data in our lives, if we were really able to be objective about the data that is coming into our lives, what we tend to find is that there is so much evidence of worth all around us. There is so much evidence of the ways in which we've built something truly spectacular for ourselves and continue to do so, that there is so much love all around us, that there's such a gift of life all around us, that there are really beautiful things happening all around us. But the reason why the worthiness wound can be really stubborn is because it refuses to see any of it. And what we tend to find instead is that when we're seeing through the eyes of the worthiness wound, we can quite easily label anything that goes against our belief that we are inadequate or that we are too much as an anomaly, as something that will just go away. And so we can't count on it. Or we'll belittle it, right? It's not that big of a deal. Like, so what if I got an A on that exam? It doesn't actually mean anything. Everybody gets A's, right? We belittle the data that tells us that actually we're doing a really wonderful thing. The worthiness wound continues to operate in our lives very loudly because it is immune to new data. And this is why it can be really hard to heal the worthiness wound through something like affirmations, through something like being told again and again that you are worthy. It's really hard to tend the worthiness wound through validation in and of itself. We tend to think that validation would be enough, that if we just got all the validation that we needed and wanted, then we would soothe this part of ourselves. It's a very earnest desire. It comes out of something very real, which is that we probably lacked the validation that we really needed. However, we can kind of see that validation in and of itself is not enough to create worthy children. If we look at children and if you're a parent or if you're around kids, we tend to see that validation is wonderful and a really instrumental part of kind of encouraging children to cultivate worth within themselves. But words are, at the end of the day, in many ways, just words. And too much validation can also land very empty and create a self-esteem that is bolstered on air. That's not really real. Superiority complex can develop. A sense of being better than everybody else can develop. With too much validation that doesn't align with the principles of attunement, of attachment, of a nurturing environment where there is space for challenge, where there's space for discomfort. Too much validation or empty validation or validation that's baked in feelings of if I just give my kids constant awards, then they will develop a self-esteem, is not actually grounded in human development. And what human development tells us is that there has to be validation, yes, but there also has to be challenge. There also has to be moments of being invalidated, right? Of being told, that's not quite right. But all of it must be held in space of care and curiosity. And so if we kind of know that intuitively for children, then that also has to be true for adults. That just finding ourselves in relationships where people tell us how good we are, how good we are, how good we are, on the one hand, can be really wonderful. And there is definitely a space for receiving validation as part of our work of tending to our worthiness wound. But in and of itself, validation actually falls quite short of what's required to tend to this place within us. What is actually required is relationships that are inherently healing relationships. Because, well, the worthiness wound, as maybe you've caught on by now, if you're new to this part of town, new to the internet, new to my internet, new to my work, I should be saying. The thing about the worthiness wound is that it is born out of relationships. It is not born out of us when we're born. It doesn't just happen. We're not just born one day feeling chronically not enough. We're not just born one day feeling like we're too much. That comes out of being communicated to, related to in a way that implies that we are too much, in ways that implies that we are not enough. The worthiness wound is born out of relationships. This isn't something I always held. I've been doing the work of understanding the worthiness wound. This is a term that I've coined personally. So you see it anywhere else out in the world. Just know that it comes out of my research and my understanding of what does it mean when we find ourselves feeling chronically broken, unlovable. What happened? What goes on inside of us when we feel this way? And when I first started understanding the worthiness wound, I was really baked into a world of kind of self-development and understanding ourselves and curing ourselves, healing ourselves through things like meditation and yoga and kind of somatic-based modalities, which I still teach to a certain extent. And really trying to understand how to ground ourselves in something bigger than ourselves. So a lot of my work was very spiritual based because I really found that because I had a lack of relationships in my life that fed me in a way that made me feel worthy, that I was going to have to look elsewhere. And universe, God filled that role really beautifully in my life. So I come into this work with, a spiritual respect, right, for different religious lineages, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, kind of very curious about how these kind of ancient ways of thinking may be able to help us understand what's going on with this sense of unworthiness. And then also how to bring that into the body, how to bring the worth into the body. Because like I said, worthiness wound is a closed loop system. It does not like to take in new data. And so if we can slow down and understand how we're understanding the worthiness wound in our body, we can start to create space for something new. All of this is taught, more somatic body relationship is taught in Worthy Women Rise. So that's kind of where I come from. That's how I first started to conceptualize the worthiness wound. We can even see how that's true from the name of it. I called it a wound because of my kind of somatic background. I really had a lot of reverence and respect, and still do, to the body and the ways in which body metaphors can really help us understand the mind and the soul and kind of the spiritual existence, the emotional body, so to speak. We can understand a wound in a body is going to fester if we don't treat it. But it's a lot harder to see that mentally. It's a lot harder to understand how, if we ignore a mental pain, it festers. We tend to prefer to think of mental life as if we ignore it, it goes away. And so calling it the worthiness wound was my way of bringing us back into reverence to the fact that, just like how the body needs tending to, and it needs, to be fed, it needs to be given water, it needs to be held, and it is so filled with wisdom, so does our mind. Our mental life, our psychic mind is also filled with wisdom, and also filled with ways in which we can get closer to ourselves. And wounds, just like physical wounds, will not go away and must be treated if it is to be kind of assimilated and made sense of. So that's why I started this work by calling it the worthiness wound. And I created a kind of framework for understanding the worthiness wound that I teach in Worthy Women Rise, of all of the kind of ways in which we may now feel chronically inadequate and not enough. And then through my learnings, if I were to now call it something else, if I were to now develop the system or reframe the worthiness wound, I would prefer to call it the worthiness paradox. Because at the end of the day, that is what it is. The worthiness wound is a paradoxal wound that tells us that who we are is not enough as born out of relationships. And that in order for us to be in relationships, in order for us to feel adequate, to feel whole, we have to change who we are. But the very act of changing who we are in relationships feeds the sense that we are not enough. Does that make sense? Let's say it another way. I actually wrote it down here and I want to find where I wrote it. Okay. The worthiness wound tells us that the relationships around us cannot handle our honesty, as an example. Right? So we believe, those of us with worthiness wounds, that to be honest in a relationship would mean that the person wouldn't like us anymore, or would be so harmed, so hurt that they would turn away in some way or reject us in some way. So the worthiness wound tells us the relationships cannot handle us, right? We are inadequate, we are broken, we're too much. Relationships cannot hold us. But by not being honest, by not being our true selves, by not being more full within ourselves, by not showing up to our relationships with an honesty about our internal experience, we're actually not giving the other person the opportunity to meet us where they're at. We're developing a relationship where we're not actually in it. And in some ways, neither is the other person. Because by the very act of us imagining that our honesty, our fullness would turn somebody away, means that we're not actually relating to them, but we're relating to our fear of them. We're relating to a sliver of who they might be, the part of them who might leave. And so we are anticipating and trying to protect them from ourselves, because if we bring the fullness of who we are, we destroy relationships. But by not being honest, we're not giving the other person, we're not actually in the relationship at all. And we're not giving the other person the opportunity to meet us where we're at. We're not actually allowing them to relate to us. So in that way, that's the paradox, that we're actually continuing to feed the worthiness wound, because we're continually find ourselves in these relationships where we're not being fully honest. The person inevitably find ways to remind us of our not honesty. We can't tolerate it. We turn away, or they turn away. The relationship is baked on a lie. But then it feeds, again, closed loop system. It feeds this idea of, see, this is why I can't be honest, because there's something really wrong with me. I hurt people that I love, and so I can't be who I really want to be. And it's a paradox. The very thing that we really want for people to love us fully, we can't take in, we can't risk, we can't open, we can't accept it. So if we think about the worthiness wound as a paradox, a relational paradox, well, then we must understand that it goes beyond just a physical cut that we then tend to, or we go to a doctor who then tends to. Both of these, in some ways, are more passive experiences that is, well, one and done. Once we do the affirmations, then it's done. But when we see it as a paradox, well, now we're understanding a little bit more, I think, that there's a lot of grappling that must be done. There must be a lot of dynamic exploration here, because the worthiness wound is relational, which means we must be in relationships to heal it. But not all relationships are healing. So it becomes really difficult to tend to and to understand and to kind of claw our way out of this closed loop system. It's not impossible. Of course, it's not impossible. I wouldn't be here talking to you about all this if it were impossible. But I do want to make it a little bit more nuanced and complicated, and maybe a little bit of heady, just so that we can appreciate for a moment the complexity of this wound and how important it is for us to hold it really tenderly. And how important it is for us to really understand that it takes time, and that it's allowed to take time. That's why I made Worthy Women Rise, a year-long program. It was first a 3-month program, then 4-month, then 5-month. And I ran my final 5-month cohort back in January. And while I love the 5-month container, I love that it's so fast paced and there's so much to learn and there's so much to grapple with. And we're kind of, we're like in a roller coaster, and it's all in. And I love that, a kind of immersive entanglement. I also really appreciate that something something meaningful can happen when we have more time. That relationships take time to develop, and it's relationships that heal the worthiness wound. And so I've made Worthy Women Rise year-long, and it will be a year-long cohort moving forward. I will not be doing any more 5-month cohorts, not because I don't love the 5-month experience, but because I see that there's such a benefit that outweighs the kind of trepidations of a longer experience. Because inevitably, when we think about the worthiness wound taking time, it means that we must allow ourselves to be in spaces that have more time, right? Like that makes sense. Yes. Okay. Let me see. I'm going through my notes here. So let's talk about a little bit more of that closed loop system, because part of what happens in the worthiness wound, right, is in the closed loop system, is that we're imagining a lot of what the other person is experiencing, whether we're conscious of it or not. Perfectionism is a great illustration of this. When we're kind of grappling with perfectionism, we are truly believing that this piece of work, this experience that we're creating, whatever it is, if we're a coach or if you're doing a project for work, whatever you're kind of delivering out into the world, delivering to another person, the perfectionist tendency is, if it's not perfect, it's going to be rejected, right? And there's a lot of control that gets entangled in perfectionism. A lot of like, I need to kind of find ways to control this output in order to manage and control the chaos of other people's minds, because there is something chaotic about another person's mind if out of the blue we're imagining that they can reject us, because that's what we're really trying to defend against when we're trying to be perfect. We're defending against rejection. We're defending against a turning away. Oftentimes we're defending against something that's very kind of like 10 steps too far, right? It's usually, and tell me if you relate to this or not, right? It's usually not like, I'm scared that if I don't do a good enough job on this piece of project, this presentation, let's call it that, I'm going to get fired. That's like so many steps ahead, right? Because typically, we don't just get fired out of the blue. Typically, I know there are so many exceptions to this, but for the most part, if you don't do well in a presentation, you'll probably have a conversation with your boss, right? They'll probably give you some feedback. They may have an opportunity to understand like what's going on between you, what's happening. Hopefully if you have a good boss, they may talk a little bit about how they may be able to support you, do your job, do this better. Maybe you need more time, maybe you need different structures, different parameters, etc. There's like a whole exploration. This is relationship being, right? This is being in relationship, the dialogue, the exploration. But for us perfectionists, for us people pleasers, for us with the big worthiness wound, we typically don't go there in our minds. We don't go, oh, I'll just talk about it with my boss and explain it, and we'll make sense of it, and we'll figure something out together. No. Usually the way it goes in our mind is, we're going to get fired. We're going to be humiliated. We're going to be laughed at. We're going to be utterly rejected, and we're never going to be able to show up again. 10 steps, way too much in the distance, right? It's not like, oh, let me do this imperfect social media post and see what happens. It's, if I don't write the perfect thing, no one's going to like it. And then no one's ever going to work with me in my business. And then I'm never going to succeed ever again. Again, so many steps into the future. This is why, it can be really, really hard then for us to kind of argue against it, because it's so out there. It's so beyond what's probably happening in the situation. Now, of course, we can find evidence to support our theory. We can definitely find ways in which we have been told that we're going to get fired, right? All this is true. But what I'm trying to highlight is that because we tend to go so far into the distance of what's happening, what we tend to find is that we're making a lot of assumptions about the other person's mind, because in some ways we're having a hard time imagining their mind. We're having a hard time imagining that they could think any way else. It's really important for us to imagine how they're understanding this. And how they're understanding this is filled with rejection. there is this concept by a man named Peter Fonagy, and I talked a little bit about this in my previous episode with Haley McGee, which you can listen on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you're seeing it on YouTube, it's not on YouTube, but it's a really beautiful conversation with this incredible, truly wonderful coach, Haley McGee. And I share a little bit about this idea of mentalization, and I really appreciate Peter Fonagy's kind of conceptualization of this because I think it really captures it very well. Where in mentalization, the kind of core idea is like, can you play with someone else's mind? Like, can you imagine that this person's mind is like vital and dynamic and is having all sorts of different explorations or experiences? Or are you imagining their minds the way you tend to imagine everyone else's minds, right? So if someone walks down the street and you recognize them and you say, hey, Betty, and Betty doesn't turn around, Betty doesn't acknowledge you, where does your mind go? Does your mind go to where it would go if anybody did that? Which is, oh, Betty doesn't like me, right? I'm probably hated. I'm probably, she's probably mad at me. I did something wrong. That's where my mind tends to go anyway, with no matter what, if anyone ignores me. Not a lot of mentalization happening there. We're not really able to be creative and play with what's happening in that person's mind. We're assuming, we're assuming a very rigid mind in the other because it's a reflection really of our rigid mind, that we're having a hard time being flexible in our experience internally, that everything is getting so crumbled into worthiness and significance and meaning about who we are in the world, right? The worthiness one is really a crumbling of self. It's really hard to hold on to a good self when we are navigating the worthiness wound. Again, closed loop system. There's a real collapsing of self, because in some ways the self hasn't really been given the opportunity to be built as a full vital human. We've been taught that we have to split off. We have to split off the bad parts of us, the parts of us that are unacceptable to our caregivers. And in that splitting off, we now have to tuck a whole internal experience away. It's not just anger, for example. It's any type of angry experience towards somebody. Usually what we're cutting off is relational experiences, a dynamic experience of what's happening within a dyad. So if we have to cut these off, we have to split off things that are unacceptable to our caregivers, then of course we're going to have a harder time than imagining that people are having a whole process internally. We're much more likely to imagine that people are very rigid in their minds. Winnicott calls the splitting off the false self versus the true self. It's a really beautiful exploration of where we kind of cut off parts of ourselves we identify as the true self, identify it so much so that we don't even know we're being untrue to ourselves. It's not like we know that we're carrying a mask. In many ways, we think that this is who we are until we start to do the healing work and kind of reconcile with the ways in which actually that's not who we are. That's how we learned we had to be. Anyway, an example of this, actually, an example of this is, I've been told all my life that I have a really hard time letting things go. And my problem is I just have to let things go. So I've internalized that and truly believed that I have a hard time letting things go. I even tattooed it on my body. I really believe that my problem is that I have a hard time letting things go. This is a true part. This is who I am. I am somebody who can't let things go. And it took healing and therapy. It took a long time for me to grapple with the fact that actually, it's not that I have a hard time letting things go. What I have a hard time with are certain internal states that other people felt really uncomfortable with and didn't want to process, didn't want to deal with, didn't want to talk to me about because of their own stuff. And they put that on me and told me essentially that my problem is I don't let things go. But I actually have no problems letting things go when I have time to work through it and when I can explore it and when I can talk about it. This is true for all of our emotional states. Things can move through us when we process them. It's when we don't process them because we're scared of the feelings or we don't know how, or they're very deep within us, that we have a harder time letting things go. So that's an example, for example, of a false self versus true self. The true self is the true me, is that I have no harder time letting things go than anybody else. The false self is I have a hard time letting things go. Okay, so we're back to mentalization and a closed system, right? So for a closed system, that means that we have to know how other people are thinking based on a very kind of rigid understanding of another person's mind. And so, if we have a hard time mentalizing, if we have a hard time imagining that Betty may be having all sorts of reasons for why she didn't respond to us, maybe the number one being that she didn't hear us, but also maybe she's having a bad day, maybe something really terrible happened. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why somebody may not have ignored us, or may not have heard us, may not have responded to us. When we have a hard time mentalizing and we imagine that we know their mind, then now we're going to respond as if we know their mind. We're going to make a lot of meaning out of their mind, a lot of meaning out of the experience. Let's say the meaning that we're making is that there's something wrong with us and Betty doesn't like us. Now we're going to respond accordingly. We're going to have now a whole internal experience of what it means that we are so broken that somebody like Betty, who we really like and respect, doesn't respond to us. Now, typically in the self-development world, or in kind of the world of spirituality that I come from, right? We're taught that meaning making is the problem. That it's the fact that we're interpreting Betty's behavior and making meaning out of it. That's the problem. And as soon as we catch that we're making that meaning, then we have to try to make another meaning. But I find that while that can be extremely useful to notice that we're making meaning, that's it. That's a big deal. To even notice that we're jumping to that conclusion is important. Oftentimes we don't even notice it. So I applaud us when we notice, oh my gosh, I just jumped to a conclusion. There's nothing wrong with that, of recognizing like, oh, I'm making meaning out of it. But now it's like, what do we do with the meaning of it? What do we do with the meaning that we just made out of it? I think we tend to relate to self-development the way that we've learned how to relate to ourselves. And so if we learn to relate to ourselves as there are certain things that are bad and wrong, then now we're going to really judge us as bad and wrong for having made meaning in that specific way. In Worthy Women Rise, we don't do it that way. What we tend to do instead is give space for the emotional experience that may come up with the meaning that we made, give air, allow it to talk, to explore, to digest it, right? To talk about it in ways that maybe we never had given space to talk about it before, so that it actually transforms. The problem isn't with the meaning making. The problem is with the shutting down of the emotional experience that comes from the meaning making, right? Does that make sense? So for example, in this example with Betty, if I can recognize, okay, I'm making the meaning that Betty is upset with me, but it probably has nothing to do with me. So I shouldn't be upset about this. So I'm going to pretend like I'm not upset about it. That tends to be the skills that we're given, right? We've made the meaning, we've noticed that we made the meaning. These are great things. And now we say to ourselves, well, now that I know that I'm making a meaning out of this, I shouldn't make meaning out of this. Right? So I'm upset. I shouldn't be upset because I don't actually know how she's feeling it. So what we do is we tend to stuff down the ways in which we actually do feel very upset. What I do in Worthy Women Rise is, okay, you've made meaning that Betty is, she doesn't like you. You're upset. Tell me about that upsetness. Let's give space for that upsetness. Let's give language to it. Let's understand it. Let's metabolize it. Let's hold space for it. Whatever language you want to put, right? Let's stay in the upsetness and bring out words that you may not have been allowed to bring out from when you were upset way back when, right? All of that is still here. It's here. Our emotional experience tells us that there is so much going on internally that we may not be aware of. And like, isn't it wonderful to be in spaces where we can talk about it and understand it in a setting where we can now allow the upsetness to exist, understand what's going on. And what we tend to find is that things start to move, not because we shut down our feelings, but because we gave it space. There's something really powerful about that. There's something really profoundly powerful. That is the work of healing the worthiness wound. It's not about never feeling inadequate. It's not about noticing when we're feeling inadequate and saying something like, oh, but I shouldn't. Oh, but I shouldn't. There's no reason for me to feel inadequate, so I shouldn't feel inadequate. No, that's not going to do much. It may help us temporarily. And hey, sometimes we need a temporary help, right? When we're in the middle of a presentation and we're standing in front of people, that may be the time when we have to be like, okay, I shouldn't be feeling upset right now. They're probably not rejecting me. Let's just keep moving. Let's just keep going. It's really important for me to just keep going. But when we've stopped the presentation after the fact, when we're home, when we're kind of reconciling with what happened, and we start to feel all our feelings about it, we're allowed to have those feelings and we're allowed to make sense of those feelings. And as we name and work through and talk about those feelings, things change. One of the kind of unspoken mottos of Worthy Women Rise is when we talk about things, things get better. And that is just a fact that I have seen over and over and over again as a therapist, as someone who's, done my own work, as somebody who does this work with, women for over a decade. I mean, everything that I teach in Worthy Women Rise is really baked in experience. It also comes out of my own expertise, my knowledge. And it also comes out of a love for this subject matter. I have such a close relationship with it. I really get it. And I bring all of that into Worthy Women Rise. This is a really unique experience where everything that I teach and everything that I do really is kind of grounded in research and not just anecdotal storytelling, but actually grounded in what works. Worthy Women Rise has had, oh my gosh, 100 women. I love certainly 10 cohorts of women who have again and again expressed that this stuff lasts. It lasts. If you put work in, if you show up, this stuff works. Okay. So that's kind of some of the ways that we can address mentalization and we can address the worthiness wound, right? Is to, while it is a closed loop system, oftentimes being closed loop means that there's so much going on inside of us that we don't have room to take in anything else. And so we have to start to first understand what's going on inside of us so we can make space for the potentiality to eventually get to a point where we can see Betty, she can ignore us, and we can be like, oh, there's probably all sorts of reasons for why that is. But also, like, let me reach out to her. Like, also, let's talk about it with her, right? Let's like reach out and say, hey, I just saw you. Is everything okay? And kind of open up the conversation, the dialogue for her to be like, actually, I am upset with you. Or more likely, sorry, I was just totally in my head. My AirPods was on. I didn't even hear you, right? That's relational skills, not self-development skills. And that makes a difference. That makes a difference to know how to navigate relationships, not just navigate our own internal experience. And so ideally, when we do this work of healing, we start to find ourselves not even going there, not even assuming that she hates us or noticing that she hates us, but then also having the space to explore all the other possibilities. Again, without the shame and a judgment of, oh, I shouldn't feel so upset about this, because that doesn't help. That's not useful. Okay, so over the course of the past 50 minutes, we've talked about my evolution of understanding the worthiness wound. We talked about how it plays out. We've talked about why it's relational and can only be healed in relationships. Of course, I can keep going about this, and there's so much good stuff that I can say about the worthiness wound. But I want to stop here. But I have some more podcast episodes coming with more conversations about this that I hope you'll find really useful. I'm also going to put in the show notes, like I said before, the previous series that I did. There's 2 of them, and actually let me pull them up right now so that I can share them with you, or talk a little bit about them with you earnestly. Let's see. Okay, so one of them is called Reclaiming Worth. It's a 10-part series that I curated in 2019, so 3 years ago. And it's really cool. If you go and listen to that, you'll see like how things have evolved and how I've taught the worthiness wound since 2019. And then I also have 10 Days of Worth series, which is compiled from a longer 21 Days of Worth Facebook Live series that I did in 2018. So this one's even a little bit older, but I break down on the kind of 10 important facets of worthiness and how to begin to heal this tender space. So have that 10-part series in 2018, the 10-part series in 2019. And now I'm going to do a little bit of, not necessarily a series, but I will be continuing to talk about worthiness. Plus, you can go to my Instagram and go to my videos. And I have so many videos about worthiness from last year. And okay. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks for joining me. Welcome to Worthiness season. I am so thrilled that you're here and that you're interested in learning more about the Worthiness Wound. I really hope that this episode was useful for you. Please let me know. Come talk to me on Instagram. I love hearing from you. It's one of my favorite things in the whole entire world. And I will be back next week to talk more.